you first came to my attention when you entered Mr. X's Contemporary Needlework Prize, and then when you went and smashed the ball out of the park by winning the machine embroidery section. So let's talk about that. How did all that happen?
Okay, so that was an interestingly long process of discovery. So I was trained as an architect and a sculptor, and my MO in that realm was, kind of have an idea for a project and then find the correct and appropriate medium to express that. And what happened that I responded to was 9/11, basically. I was, 30 years old at the time. I grew up in New York, like right below the World Trade Center, but at that time I had moved to Central Virginia. My wife and I were ready to start a family there, and when that happened, like that monumental destruction in such a short time, was very intense. And then what happened in the aftermath for me was, in the States, everybody had an American flag bumper sticker or an American flag in the window. So, like, it was everywhere. And then over a few months, that image, due to just age and sunlight and weather, those things started to fade in color, and it struck me as really poignant, because the sentiment at the time, the kind of patriotic slogan was, "These colors don't run," and what I was seeing before my eyes was these colors were fading, and I kind of it resonated with me in terms of the physical image, but also the grief I was carrying, and I thought to myself, well, how long does this grief last? Does it go on forever? And if it goes on forever, do the flags fade forever? And if they fade forever, then what do they look like? Are they completely white? And so that was the concept for me of I had this image in my head of this white American flag that I needed to then say, okay, how is this going to get? How do I interact with this as an artist? And I was not a fiber artist. I never did anything with fiber. Actually, I know I did. I did one interior project where I made curtains, so I had a sewing machine. And I thought, well, do I bleach a flag? And I bleached a flag, and just took that flag right apart. And so I knew that wasn't going to be it. So I started to say, well, what if it's an additive constructive process? And I just took white fabric and white thread, and I joined white stripes to white stripes, and I embroidered on it white stars. And then the image I got was this image that read in two ways. It was either this bright white flag with light reflecting off of it, like this, flag of surrender, or in silhouette. You totally understood, you could totally read the pattern, and it was very clear what it was. And that tension, to me, was pretty powerful. But at the same time, that flag alone like that felt a little sad and defeated. And so as I pondered it more, I thought, does this, what if this were all the flags and they were all together? And, if you had this idea of all the flags kind of giving something up, like this basic color scheme, they could then kind of be unified in this single whole, but still retaining their individual characteristics. And that was the conceptual and kind of, that was the thrust of the project. That was the framework. And then the realization of it was, how do I do this? And with that, first American flag project, I thought well, I can try and embroider stars by hand, but I've never done that before. And then as I don't know how I found it, or maybe I went to a sewing store that had embroidery machines, but I realized I could, these can be embroidered by machine. And at the time, I found somebody with an embroidery machine and just had them, I gave them the specs, and I picked a star and had them, I showed them the layout. Obviously, it's the layout of the American flag. And then they embroidered the stars on it. and it was kind of proof of concept. It held together. It looked as I wanted it to look. And then the idea was, well, now there's a whole other bunch of flags to make, and how am I going to do that? And um, I did a couple of embroideries by hand, but I realized like this is not going to work in that respect. It's not me. It's not like I
Mm.
don't have that skill. I don't particularly feel compelled to learn it. And for the size of this job, I'll never get it done. And part of the job was completing it, within some sort of timely manner so that it was relevant. And so I basically got myself a small not residential, domestic embroidery machine, like a Husqvarna Viking with
Mm-hmm.
the slide-on arm, and basically just started to I did a lot with graphics at the time, computer graphics, so I had a good grasp on using computers to to generate CAD imagery and stuff like that. And but I was always interested in using computers to make stuff, like as an architect. Like
Mm.
that was definitely something I wanted to do. And then this just kind of scratched that itch. And um, over time, I was working at the time, and so when because sewing and fibers was not my you know inherent nature. I didn't grow up doing that. I was a builder. Everything was straight edges and straight lines and kind of power tools. And here was this kind of world where everything was a little flexible. Um, so I would start and I'd do some of these flag patterns, and then I'd have to put it down for a while and I'd come back to it, and I would have to relearn everything again and again and again. And at a certain point, um, I just committed to getting the project done, and that was like 5 years after it. Like I think for 5 years, I only had like 8 flags, and I would actually go out in public with them and stand around with this contraption that was an old, restaurant umbrella, which I took the top off of it and made it flat, and then I'd just stand there with 8 flags and talk to people about it, because it was still a very raw, relevant topic for people. And then as that's the thing, like years passed, and it was getting up, like it was 2008 at that time, or not, no, it's 2009. And I said, oh my God, it's like we're coming up on the 10th anniversary already. If I don't get this project done, I will never get it done, just to be
Yeah.
honest with myself. And so I kind of took a hiatus from from working in an office, and focused on it. And my wife was a steady income earner. And um, once I was able to focus on it, I was able to create a rhythm. And for the first time in my life, I kind of definitely have diagnosed ADHD, and that was late in life that I was diagnosed. So I started to understand, like, um, you know, my ability to get things done was this was the first time. This was the first medium where I could say, like, oh, I've got like 2 flags to do, and this is how much time it's going to take. And then it started to actually take that amount of time, because I was developing the skill with digital embroidery that I was just getting deeper and deeper into. And ultimately, by the 10th anniversary, I was able to finish the project. And then after that, I was kind of liberated from that yoke that I've been carrying.
Yeah.
And then the question was like, well, what do I want to do now with this new skill? And it was not just like, so before, as an architect and a sculptor, I would go from project to project, find out, like, come up with an idea, and then come up with this medium to express that idea. And each time in that arc, I would kind of pick the most complicated thing, and I'd have to learn, kind of create a technique, create a method, and spend all the time doing it. And then once it was done, it was like it was completely inapplicable to anything else for the most part. So I would start over. And that was, it was very, I don't want to say it was very frustrating, but I realized, like, I can't build anything out of this, like it's totally inefficient from like the ability to to make money off of this also.
Mm.
And so that was part of it, was seeing like, oh, here's a medium that I'm finally like getting some mastery over, and it's kind of so open-ended that I can do so many things with it, um, that aren't just in this very restricted bandwidth of what that flag project was, which was white on white. Like that really helped me focus on saying like, okay, well, I just have to do this one thing, and like it takes out a lot of the guesswork. But when I was uh, in, like interpreting patterns from flags, there were choices to make, but because it was all white on white, the bandwidth wasn't so overwhelming. And
Mm.
then I was at a point where it's like, okay, now I have some mastery. Now I can start to choose some other options. And what I chose at the time was to kind of go to what really interested me about the embroidery machine. Because when I first got it, and I'm assuming you've used them before, but like I would just stare and watch it draw. Like I just couldn't
Yeah.
take my eyes off it. And it took, at a certain point, you're like, okay, I gotta not do that because it's just a waste of time. But like it was a really cool drawing tool.
Mm.
And I thought to myself, the things that I like to draw or that I envision that would be really interesting with this are these computer aided like CAD wireframe models of like these intricate structures, like these intricate geometries that I could generate, through my architectural software, and find a way to get it to translate it into that. And that was that was step one of saying like that's what I want to do. And then um, once I realized I could do that, make these interesting linear drawings, I then looped back to my architectural side, which was like, well, how do I make this spatial? How do I make this something that feels architectural in a way? Because to me, if it doesn't do that, it's not something I want to do. And so I thought like, uh, how big can I make these things? And so I started researching, and I never knew about industrial embroidery machines. And then, you go online and you're like, oh my, there's some big stuff out there.
Mm.
And there was one SWF machine that had like a 3-foot square hoop, like a meter by meter. And I called up a dealer of it in the States, and I said, you know, can you tell me if anybody in my area has these? And I was like, well, no, I can't tell you, but I'll give you some phone numbers. And he gave me some phone numbers. And the first place I called was a embroidery, kind of like it was on a military base, the Quantico military base. And it was this, family owned shop of where they made service tags, for, for service people, but they
Mm.
also did some flag stuff. And that's why they got that machine. And I said, if I showed up with a file, would you run it? And they said, yeah, that's fine. And so on like the very rudimentary software I had, it took me probably a week and a half to do this densely packed linear, structure. It's like, it was, I'm, it's really hard to describe, but it
Mm.
was, probably 1,000 lines. I don't know, just packed together really tightly, creating a geometric structure. And I went in finally when I had the file, and remember thinking, okay, I've now put so much time and energy and like hope into this working. I don't know what's going to happen when I scale it up this big. It could all fall apart. And then I was a little terrified. I was like, well, if it does, then what am I going to do? Because like I kind of put all my hopes and dreams in this. And so I went on Facebook and said, well, this is what I'm about to do, and this might fail completely, and then you won't hear from me for a while. And when it started to go, it was a like kind of these kind of almost neon colors on a black background, and it really
Mm.
popped on the screen, and people were really quite taken with it. And I had some architect friends who said, "Wow, can you do architecture with this? Like, can you just make it big?" And I like the answer is always going to be yes. And so I got contracted to do a project with them, which was an entire mural of embroidery, about 65 feet wide and about 7 feet high, for this apartment in Miami. And um, and they were really taken by that shape, the torus. It's like the
Hmm.
donut shape that I was doing, and they gave me a lot of free reign to come up with a concept for it. And they thought like, oh, if you could just have like a whole world of these things, um, and when going into that project, the fortunate thing, well, two things happened. It was finally of a scale and of a budget that, like, there was decent funds behind it. So I decided to invest in my own industrial embroidery
Okay.
machine, and
Right.
one that had not as big a hoop as the last one that I mentioned, but about a 2 foot square hoop. And um, so I started to work with that, and the lucky thing was, like, the project got kind of delayed in permitting, so there was just an extended period of R&D for me in there. And the switch I made, or like the discovery I made doing that R&D, was going from this idea of linear drawing of these wireframes to hatching in the areas of these shapes. And when I did that, in this kind of, and the architects wanted this kind of white on white muted things, similar to the flags, because they wanted something very subtle. They didn't want something overpowering. So hatching these areas on these geometric shapes with the white thread made it much more about light reflections.
Mm.
And that was like the major shift for me, to say like, oh, I can, it almost feels like glass. And if I change, the angle of incidence from, for the threads, I can make areas of dark and light. And that was something I worked with the flags. It was much more kind of like, 45-degree angles where it's like either light or dark. And here in the software I was using, I could, adjust by a degree what I was doing. And so then I could kind of, make much subtler sweeps of shaded light, that as you moved around it, it would kind of create this fake relief, an
Mm.
illusionistic relief, so that it felt three-dimensional. And really, that was the arc to get to where, you know, I had kind of developed a language that I was ready to work with. And so from there, other things have spooled out over time, and kind of new discoveries have been made. But that's that's how it kind of came together.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. That was that's an amazing story. Right, there's a lot to unpick there. I've got lots of questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
Um, First of all, so you made how many white flags did you make in total?
I did 193. Like, the container was that I settled on was like the flags of the UN. So I figured, okay, here's something people can agree upon. These are like, this is a unified body. So that
But
was,
for like 8 years, you only had 8 of them.
yeah.
That's amazing. That turnaround. You must. I mean, to me, I guess that's the point at which you started making this a craft thing. Then just focusing your attention on it, having the time to. And was that? I mean, were you still working with like a domestic machine at that point, and just sort of understanding the mechanics of construction?
Yeah, like, the whole flag project was on a domestic machine, and I would have to. What was good about that machine is that you can um, tile things together with some accuracy. Like, you could pick your last point and rotate your pattern to match up, so that you can create something over. Sometimes I had to do like 9 tiles, which was a
Mm.
lot.
Just out of interest, have you got a favorite flag to recreate in white? Are there any that particularly were good fun?
Um, from a purely graphic point of view, the flag of Uganda I always thought was interesting, because it has this unexpected pattern of colors in their stripes. I think it's like black, yellow. I can't remember if it's red, but then it repeats in a weird way that's just unexpected and asymmetrical, I would say. And when you do it in white, that kind of disappears. But from a embroidery point of view, like the flag of Cambodia, that was one of the early ones I did with, where I had to do 9 tiles, and I really started to play with like the light of saying like, okay, this stuff can be, even though the pattern is this temple, Angkor Wat,
Mm.
um, I can make all the stuff read the same, like in the same value, or I can play and have some light and dark going on. I don't know. It's a very, I like that flag.
Mm.
Um, and from a sewing point of view, doing the Union Jack, man, that was like sewing a pizza together to get the thing to sit flat. Like there was no embroidery on that, but like, and I think I did that like at the peak of, being in the project and finally getting all my stuff together to understand how to do something like that.
Of course, the fun thing with that is you get to do micro versions of it on a few other flags as well. I think, don't you? I think there are
Yep, yeah.
little UK references.
But those I did as embroidery.
Right, right,
It
right.
made it a little easier.
Then the next thing that I'm interested in is the fact that then you had these 8 flags, and there was a drive in you that was sufficient for you to go out and almost make performance of them.
Yeah, yeah.
Performance art out of them. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I lived in, at the time, Charlottesville, Virginia,
Hmm.
which yeah, became famous in 2017 when they had the Nazi march that walked through there. So
Fantastic.
it's and but the town has its own you know kind of history where Thomas Jefferson was, and where Monticello is, and um, in what year was it? It's probably about 2005, 2006. They built a this monument that was like a chalkboard, and it was the Thomas Jefferson Monument to Free Expression, the freedom of expression, and it was just a blank chalkboard where they would put out chalk and people could write anything. And it just, when it went up, I thought like, oh, here's a you know a locus of attention that
Hmm.
is kind of asking for speech. And I had this thing at the time that I felt like, okay, I can apply this to this. And so I would locate myself there for the most part. Um, and it was weird. It was like, I'm pretty introverted for the most part. Um, I'm not a performative person, but I felt like this was something, I don't know, I just felt driven to do it. And,
Hmm.
and that was the start of it. And then I'd move around to other places in town and do it as well.
Did you find that there, because it's such an interesting concept, what you're trying to achieve, the story you're trying to tell, but then when you look at it as a stranger, I'm interested how many people understood what you're trying to do, and what other, like, how other people interpreted it. Were there people that interpreted it in ways that you didn't expect?
Yeah, yeah. I kind of got all comers basically. Um, but the one thing I would say though is I was surprised that a lot of people really intuitively got it. They would just kind of
Right.
say, "Oh, I get it." That was nice.
Hmm.
And then I'd get other reactions that were like, since it was pretty, still in the shadow of 9/11, it's like, wait a second, do you want the terrorists to win? And it's like, is it about giving up? And I was like, no, it's about giving into change and understanding that the world changes. And
Hmm.
um, I don't know, maybe being young and naive, I have no idea. But and one of the really interesting interactions I had was um, on that, pretty much down by that monument to free expression. An older black man, about 65, 70, came up to me and he felt the fabric. It was like this white cotton duck. And he's like, these are Klan flags. And I was like, whoa, like that is not my intention.
Hmm. Yeah.
I told him like the genesis of the project and my intention behind it. And, but like he couldn't shake his visceral
Yeah.
understanding of that. And, I did not fight him on it. I just said like, I get it. Not my intention.
Hmm.
And, I thought it was a very valuable, um, you know, dialogue that could happen. And
Yeah.
like, I would say, what that was 15 years, almost 20 years ago. Oh my God. Uh,
Hmm.
I would say I fear that those conversations would be, I'd be hard pressed to be able to have a conversation like that these days.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting the power of symbolism and how people, we see a sign and we interpret it one way, and it's quite hard to change that without, or it's quite easy. I had a thing the other day. There's a mantra I quite like which says, "I'm never angry for the reason I think," and I think that's quite a useful thing to hang on to. But some people can't really get past that. They can't really go, "Okay, that's my response to it," but it isn't the only response to it, And I guess the problem is those kind of dialogues are so intrinsically bound up in people's identity and their culture and the lives that they've gone through that it's not really for the challenging, is it? It's just for sort of going back. That's a really valid point. Thanks very much. To me, it feels like the flags are almost like fossils. That's how I see it.
Mm,
Because if we span forward 1,000 years, none of these countries are going to be in the same format whatsoever. So it's almost like that kind of looking back and seeing. And in some ways, I guess that's a commentary on the societal discourses of the time, isn't it? Because flags represent how we present as a nation to the rest of the world and that kind of thing. And you kind of wonder what the flags of 1,000 years in the future might look like.
right, right. I mean that you know, I kind of chose to go out in public with a fairly optimistic message for
Mm,
people, but like inside at the same time, I thought like if it all goes tits up basically, then we're all gonna be we could all perish together, and like there's
yeah,
this unifying theme of uh, you know we could all choose to be like kind of come together, or we can just kind of end up being reduced to all of the things that we hold on to that we think are you know uh, things of our identity, like they could be taken away from us by just larger events, larger
yeah,
historical events.
yeah. Or fungus. I watched The Last of Us not that long ago. It's the same sort
Oh,
of thing. Do for a lot of people, the process of making, particularly when it's things that are personal, pertinent, managing, dealing with emotions and stuff, the process of making can often be a tool for healing, or certainly a tool like a kind of therapeutic tool. Did you find that with the flags? Did you find that you felt differently at the end of the process to when you began?
definitely. Like I knew it was I could tell it was like a therapeutic process for me. And I mean what I felt, what I got out of it though, what was nice was having done it, I was given something. I was given this skill, it
Mm,
was given this thing that then became, the trajectory of what I chose to do. So, there was, a real healing in that, because, I
mm.
was searching before.
And can you remember when you first sort of saw some light shimmering? I've written down the word shimmer a couple of times in my notes about you. When you saw a shimmer happening on some thread because the light was hitting it in a certain way, can you kind
Yeah.
of remember going, hmm,
Yeah. Like I would say the first time was working on that piece I mentioned that I blew up really large,
hmm,
where it was, all these lines that were just tightly packed together, and then there was a surface.
hmm,
It was like an accidental surface, um, because I was doing something that was made up of a linear construction, but because all the lines were packed so tightly, you know there was that shimmer, and like that was the first time I saw it. And then I think the second time I saw it, when I was in that project for the mural, um, I was doing the torus shape, and in one of the tight areas where you know threads were packed tightly, again it was just like this accidental service, and I was like, wow, what's happening there? And 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 then thankfully that was a quick jump, probably a month, to the next thing where I intentionally you know said, okay, well, I'm going to fill this area with thread, as opposed to the first time with that project where they were, that I mentioned that it was accidental. That happened, probably a year and a half, 2 years before.
right. Yeah, because you can sort of see that. Like I was looking at your geometry pieces, which are what 2012 onwards, that kind of time bracket, I think, or something. And you can see, like you're saying, some of them. There were a couple from 2014, black backgrounds. Really like the interplay of the different neon threads back against one another. You get that kind of illusion where a thing catches and
Yeah,
forms. And then also, I've seen that in some of the work you've got on your website from installations back in the
yeah,
day before you even picked up a needle and thread. You had one called Transformer, which was the
right,
same sort of thing where when you drove past it, it would solidify and then unsolidify as
exactly.
a sort of, what's the word, like a Doppler effect or something, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's yeah, because the form was twisted, and you'd kind of just get this, you know, this sense of this packing of material in a way that, at the out, it was either expansive or contracting. It was, very
Mm,
much the same type of geometry that I was
yeah.
working
So I think that's the interesting thing to me. I think the same, you did a bath cloud project, which was just a
with. Hmm.
series of shapes on a ceiling, which again, where you're walking in the space and how the light's hitting it is gonna, I guess, almost like undulation and waves and that kind of thing. But it's interesting that I don't know when you made those pieces, but clearly somewhere at the back of your head, there's just this general concept, isn't it, of like
Yeah,
optical illusion and that kind of structure that's persisted.
yeah. It's funny because I grew up. My dad had a glass business, and I would go, like, he was just glass and mirrors, and you go. He had a small shop, and I remember from a very young age going in and you know he had some stacks of glass in there, and you look at it from the side, and there's that depth, that like incredible depth of looking into the side of a piece of glass. But when it's stacked, it's like you can really get a sense of space and depth and illusion. And yeah, so I think stuff like that has been with me for a long time.
You said fairly early on that you didn't really. Well, obviously, you've not got much of a prior stitching heritage. I mean, can you, like, when you were a kid, where you kind of, you must have been a creative sort to want to go into architecture, I would have thought.
Yeah, you know what I would do? I would go to the store and get, like, little pom poms and googly eyes, and make characters and stuff like that. Um, and but like never really, I don't remember ever really sewing anything, with
What kind of stuff did you like to make when you were younger?
um, kind of just anything, like anything that, like, I'm such a kinetic kind of learner that anything I can kind of put together, like that's how I understood the world. Um, and it kind of goes back to what I said about, just as a sculptor, it's like, well, I just come up with an idea and try and find, well, that's the thing. I always struggle with this because it's not just like, oh, I came up with the idea. Sometimes I'm just playing with things and
Mm.
materials, and it's like then it gives me an idea that loops back, and it's like, how do I kind of expand on this? So yeah, like, we would make, we make weapons and stuff like that. You're young boys, you're like,
Yeah.
how do we do all this stuff? And my brother was the one who would make the intricate, like, models and stuff of airplanes and ships. And when he outgrew them, he gave them to me, and all I would do was destroy them. But like, for making my own stuff, I would just, it was always just a kind of way to explore and discover the world.
And did you follow that through when you became an architect? Because I don't know. I remember wanting to be an architect and then learning how long it takes to become an architect and then deciding I didn't want to be an architect anymore because
Right.
it was too much. But it feels like a lot of architecture is grounding dreams in reality and that thing of, you can build a building that looks like a cloud, but it's got to have foundations, work that one out, and then sort of
Right.
extrapolate. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about as well?
Yeah, I mean, I just never got so deep into the profession myself, because I think I was always, I just sitting at the desk, and the patience that would take to see if that would pay off into, creative freedom. I just I went for not the short. I just went for the things that I could just, again, my hands could touch this stuff, and I can do it. So I just kind of scrabbled my way through to make it work that way. but yeah, like the like on my website, like you said, there are these smaller installation projects that were very much about like creating like a wall out of string and threaded rod. It was just
Mm, mm,
like three threaded rods, and then those rods have a spiral on it, and like that spiral became the path for a single piece of twine that would go around, and it would, because all the threads were a line going down, you get a very straight, a series of parallel lines um, that created a surface. And then what that surface did was kind of acted a little bit like glass, where if light was reflecting off it, it just, you couldn't see through it. And then if light was behind it, you would see through it. So, for me, it's like that idea of subverting materials, or transforming them into some other realization was, yeah, I think that's what really drives me, is like just this discovery of finding something unexpected in materials.
Did you ever have a spirograph as a kid? I don't even know if they have those in America.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know the.
Actually, I remember buying the spirograph for my kids when they were like, I don't know, 7 or 8 for, 1 year for their birthdays, because I thought like, hey, you know, this is such a cool toy. And I definitely remember having them and using them.
I feel like I think we've got one of those, and I really feel like I want to get it out. I'm probably going to get more out of it than my children are by a long shot. But
Right.
um, so then the interesting thing, like, because I've done a bit of digitized embroidery. I know what you mean about you just stare at it when you first get one for a long time, and I remember using it to try and do cross stitch. And I also learned as well that if you stop staring at it, the chances of it snarling up on you exponentially increase. I don't know what that is, whether it's just bad luck or whatever. But the interesting thing about digitized embroidery, and the thing that I see the connection for you, is that a lot of it is about engineering and about surface tension and about
Right.
distortion and about all those kind of factors. So it feels like, in a way, that architecture and all the things that you've gone through are a perfect training for the fundamental principles of these design. Have you found that you've really taken to it because you've already kind of learnt a lot of this physical law stuff?
Um, yeah, I would say that's probably a given. And I just remember realizing at a certain point, that like, oh, the thread is my, like, that's my lowest common denominator. I can't, unless you get a thin thread size, and I can go a little bit lower with that, but you can't fight that. Like, you're never going to make something, so intricate that it's going to overcome the the, the dimensions of that thread. So when you're dealing
Mm,
with it, um, you have to deal with that. And the early part of doing the embroidery was learning about, like, oh, if you put too much thread on top of each other, it's going to snarl and break, because it's too tight, it heats up, and it's not possible. And I think part of my craft, and like, the thing that I kind of push myself on is like, you know how how few layers can I do? Like,
mm,
like, like, how simple can I make it and still get the effects I want without having to belabor it, like, oh, I'm going to layer up. Because one of the actual really interesting things that I found with the embroidery, especially when I switched over to the industrial machine, was it was almost like working as a printmaker, where you get a hoop, you hoop something, and if your fabric's good and taut, especially if you're using synthetic fabric, it's like a drum. It doesn't distort.
mm.
I could stitch something, take it off, leave it for a while, then think about some other stuff, and then go back and do it, and add more layers to it. And that started to really help when I would say in like 2019 or so, discovered I can paint on the threads and dye them. That was like a real kind of turning point for me, because I went on this, did an artist residency that I was invited to. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's Aramont Pentaculum. It's in Tennessee,
Right.
at the Aramont School. And they said, do you want to come and be in the fiber group? And what was interesting was, like, I had never worked around other fiber artists because I didn't, I didn't get schooled in that, and then I did it
Mm.
myself. And so I went and I was in a group of about 5 or 6 people who all were doing different things, and a couple of them were dying, like dying wool threads, just whatever. And I was like, huh. I went down with a bunch of pre-stitched stuff that I thought, oh, maybe I'll like collage this, or because I wasn't bringing my machine, I was just going to bring raw material and see what happened. And then I was just dunking stuff in dye baths, and what I discovered there was, um, it wasn't my discovery, but people helped
Mm.
point it out to me. But it was, you know, natural fabrics and fibers take dye, and synthetic ones resist them. And here I have the capability of working with synthetic fabrics as underlays or natural fabrics as underlays, and I have the option to use uh, synthetic threads or natural threads or a mix of both. And again, it was just this whole new realm of saying, like, how can I introduce color into this, um, and like what variables can I play with to get different effects. So to go back to that idea of working as a printmaker on the machine, I would start to stitch something out, paint on some of the threads in one color, then go back, stitch more white threads, and then paint another color, and start to use the machine and its ability to layer and this new technique in there. Um, but like the, the what was interesting about the painting also was, as I was developing early on and kind of doing the geometric stuff, the light stuff, and starting to make canvas pieces, frame canvas pieces. And I started to get feedback from people in the art world about it. One of the things I heard was like, this feels a little mechanical. It doesn't feel like the artist's hand is in this. And,
Mm.
it stung a little because it's like, well, you don't know how much going into like figuring this out, and like, how much goes into making these things. But, it was fair criticism because it's their reading of it. And then that discovering the ability to paint on this really did let me introduce that element of the hand and the unexpected, because that's something I always struggled with. Like, I'm, you know, good at the technical part and good at the kind of imagining and kind of designing like an architect. Like, you design it and then you kind of produce it. But I was always much more hesitant, cautious, uptight, you pick the word, to like just do something free on it. And now I had kind of created a structure that of like a geometry or bones to um, to what I was making, that I felt confident enough to then do this other freeform stuff on, which added to the effect of the light, because if you have a gradation of color going over something, your eye is starting to see gradation from the start, and then as you move along, it's starting to change more and more because of the light. So it it definitely reinforced what I was doing to begin with, and made it richer, I thought.
Yeah, that's interesting because the minute you start putting, like you say, dyes, and that means you have to consider what materials you're using. In a way, you're just adding layers of risk into the process, aren't you?
Mm,
Because prior to that, I guess monocolor, monochrome, whatever kind of designs is it's low risk, isn't it? It's kind of like you're just doing the one thing in a certain way, and there's a safe space for experimentation, which I guess
right,
is akin to some of the things you were saying before about being a designer, because you can plan it out and it can be machine precisely and all that sort of thing. Whereas now you're taking these steps of being like, okay, let the die fall where it may, and that kind of thing.
right,
How do you feel about that? Is it terrifying, or are you just going, well, just go for it?
yeah. No, it was really liberating because I always kind of, yeah. Did I say I wanted to do it? I mean, I
Hmm.
felt like I can do it, but I just needed some sort of framework in which I could justify it, understand it.
Hmm.
So it's not just like totally random. Like, I don't like doing random stuff. I like there being a purpose for like everything I'm doing. um and I feel like I had a good natural color sense that I never got to exercise.
And you'd also built up such a foundation of understanding about the mechanics of the machine stitch and the fabric tension and that kind of thing, that you're experimenting with something that's familiar, isn't it? It's not like you're going straight out the back and going, right, I'm going to make ice
Right.
sculptures with a chainsaw, never ever done it before, that sort of thing.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. How do the ideas come now? Because I know that you've still done quite a few pieces of work that are very much connected to current events and to your own experiences and stuff. Is that the theme that underpins a lot of your work, like your journey through life and your perception of the world around you? Is that how you feel it goes?
No, I mean, I feel like now I'm kind of more into the geometry stuff that I'm doing now, the forms. I feel like it's pushing something that's more universal, like
Mm-hmm.
uh, forms that just feel like they could exist in the world, even though they're kind of made up or imagined, or this. I'm trying to remember if at some point I thought to myself, because this is like glass, I kind of want it to feel like a window, and like I was, pushing that for a while, and then, once it was, I think this piece right here is like where,
Mm-hmm.
I was able to dye this piece of linen, do this geometry on it, and I pre-dyed those turquoise squares. That was separate. Then I appliqued them on, and suddenly like all the elements started to come together to feel like, oh yeah, now I feel like I'm getting at some of this stuff I wanted to try to get at with architectural, stained glass type thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to, kind of create a sense of peace on the work, some, just calm, uh, which I was going for with the flags, but that was
Mm.
so charged in other ways. But this is just, more of an abstract representation of that for me.
Yeah, and I mean that's fair, because I think I know I did a NeedleXChange with Jack Roberts, JPR Stitch, and his work is just abstract. And I think what it takes a lot of nerve, I think, personally, to do abstract work, because you're not it's so it is conceptual. It's not very literal. People can interpret it in whichever way they want. But in the same way, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? Because you're not particularly pushing forward a message, you're just saying, this is my offering to you. And I guess as well, you're looking at the simplicity of the shapes and the forms, which in and of themselves don't come with any baggage necessarily. So I
Yeah.
guess it is just, yeah, you're just offerings.
Yeah. And when I was an undergrad and I did like art and sculpture as an undergrad, I remember thinking like, oh man, abstract work terrifies me, because who am I to do something like that and call it art,
Mm,
and
mm,
and so again, like actually the first thing my first artistic inspiration was architectural scaffolding, because I like lived in New York when I was young, and you go around the city, and Christo, the guy who wraps all the buildings, right?
mm.
That guy, that sculptor.
Yeah.
So these were like kind of Christo sculptures, because they'd have these temporary structures. They'd have like this mesh on them. They'd catch the light and shadows of other buildings, and conceptually it was really cool, because then these are temporary structures. They come apart and then be kind of mixed up, and they'd appear in different parts around the city. So it was like this architectural common denominator, and I started like that was how I first started to kind of address ideas in art and say like, here's something I'm trying to get at, and I was somewhat literal in it. I mean, I just make these repetitive sculptures and stuff like that, and like as like analogous to scaffolding. But again, that's just because I had nothing inside of me that was like, okay, I'm just going to do the swoosh, and like, because that's not there.
There's have you seen there's a program called How To with John Wilson. He's a New
Oh,
York documentary maker
oh,
who films literally everything, and then he's done 3 series of this show. I think it might come out on HBO, but I watched it over here. And they're different topics, and it's kind of meandering the way it works out. But the second episode in the first series was called "How to Put Up Scaffolding," and it was very
Really?
much looking at that thing in New York of saying, you don't realize how much scaffolding there is until you pay attention to it, and then you realize that it is everywhere.
Right, right.
And it's part so many buildings that like scaffolding is part of the building because it kind of has to be, and then laws change about the structures of buildings and all of that kind of thing. And it's like it is that thing. It's like there's an element of creation that's bolted onto all these things that not a lot of people notice, but when you do, you can't stop seeing it all the time.
Right,
I think
right.
you'd very much enjoy that program.
I will definitely look that one up. In fact, actually, after college, when I graduated, I applied for and got a very small travel grant to go to China and the idea was to look at their use of bamboo for scaffolding because it was, they would just 70-story skyscraper and their scaffolding was just bamboo lashed together with these plastic ties. And I mean, that was incredible, like from a physical standpoint and from like a aesthetic standpoint. But what, interested me because I was always like obsessed with like these little modules and like the repetitive pieces. What, became the thrust of that project was like, oh, what's it like when a culture builds scaffolding with this thing that they use for so many other, uses like, and so I just went and basically toured around and photographed stuff. And, that was in the 90s before China just really, modernized. So yeah, exactly. But they still do, they still do the bamboo scaffolding.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think we can expect a bamboo series? Spin forward 10 years. Aaron's all about the bamboo now.
Actually, I lived one of the houses we lived in Charlottesville had a bamboo grove. So I made some stuff with it, but mostly it was just like keeping it back because it grows like crazy.
Yeah, it does. It grows like Billy-O, doesn't it?
Yeah, right.
What else? What other questions did I have? To be honest, I think I've run through all my main questions. Here we go. Tips for people who want to do digitized machine embroidery and tips for people who want to unlock the power of their sewing machine. Have you got like your top 3 tips for making good use of your machine?
I think it depends entirely on how, like, do they want to use pre-designed patterns or do they want to like explore? Because I probably used, besides the stars for that American flag, I probably stitched one pre-designed pattern like in all the years I've been doing this. So I don't know that world. I mean, what I would say is maybe it's good to use those to learn stuff. Although I think, those usually come as stitch files, so they're a little harder to pick apart, but you could probably get in there and see, how it works. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe it's like, using, find some pre-stitch pattern you like and really pay attention to how it stitches because again, it's a construction project. It's layered in a certain way. It's, lines are formed in a certain way. And that's, when these pre-stitched patterns look good, they look good for a reason because they're well crafted. So, that's one way of learning. It's like, what is that, Scott Joplin, who learned to play piano from like those player pianos with the rolls. He would just have it play and then he'd follow along with his fingers. And that's how he learned.
Amazing. Right.
So like that's one thing. And then I think the other is like if you wanted to make your own stuff, just find some idea. It could be like the simplest idea possible, but try to translate that idea into some element of stitching. It could be a character, it could be text, it could be nature, but think about like what the expression you're going for is, and then how the lines that you're afforded that you can make, or even if you're doing free form, like I haven't really done free form digital embroidery, but an idea is always going to be the thing that kind of carries you through with interest. I mean, it's very hard to maintain interest if you're not trying to reach a goal because you have something in your head. I think, at least for me.
There's do you think it's worth, like, for beginners, because sometimes it can almost be you're learning a new technology and trying to think of a new idea could be really difficult. So you could get off just recreating a logo that you've seen or something like that, isn't it? Just
Yeah,
something that you don't have to burn your soul to create in the first
sure.
place,
Yeah, yeah, and it's yeah. I mean, that's I think the much of the history of art is like copying something and seeing how it
Mm,
was made. So um, yeah, and it's a great like there's such versatile machines that like, and people are going to have different interests going in. Like mine, I said I narrowed it down to like that white thread, but like maybe it's the colors, that are drawing people in. What I got to say, the thing about the domestic machine that was really gives a lot more flexibility than an industrial machine is I could go in, like create some pattern and then go in the software and just delete all the stitch points between like the ends, and then you just get these really long threads. And
yeah, yeah.
like I really like that. I kind of miss that because I just don't get on that machine anymore.
Mm. I'm going to do a shout out to my man Eric Campbell, who used to write a column for Mr. X called Ghost in the
Oh
Embroidery Machine.
yeah, yeah, I follow
And
him.
yeah, his YouTube channel, he does it somehow. I mean, what he knows about like digitized embroidery, he knows everything.
Right.
He's also amazingly managed to do, at current count, 190 weekly podcasts
Mhm.
about machine embroidery, and
Wow.
yet doesn't seem to be tired yet or something. He's got so much to learn. So I think, yeah, for anybody who needs to understand any of the technology and also like the philosophy and stuff, I think Eric's a great resource to go on
Definitely.
there. I'm guessing you quite enjoy digging around inside that software then and kind of coming up with structures and seeing what you can achieve.
Yeah, and that's like when I made that jump from the domestic machine and the software that came with it, which was at best rudimentary, to I use Wilcom,
Mm-hmm.
and it gives a level of control, um, where you can isolate things from something else, so you can get at other aspects of it, and it can do quite a bit. And when I was searching for the ideas I wanted to push, um, like it had the capability to do those things and then some. And
Mm.
so I've been a big fan of that software, and it's been very stable and reliable and versatile.
Yeah, shout out to Wilcom as well, because I know they give a lot back to like the machine embroidery sector as well. I know
Yeah,
that.
definitely.
Do you find there's much of a difference between what you plan to make and what actually comes out at the back, or have you got that pretty well nailed down?
um it's I think when it's good, you're still discovering things. I have a writer friend that says, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like if you can still, come up with things that are, new to you, then that'll be good for the viewer. Um, and I gotta say, I'm kind of pathological when it comes to not being able to do the same thing over and over again.
Uh-huh.
Like, and it comes at a cost, to like it's that same impulse, like, oh, I'm just going to do the next thing and learn the next thing, and um,
But at
yeah,
least in this instance, you're doing different things within a larger, broader context that may
right,
have some economical stability
right,
underpinning it.
right, and that's was always a sense of like here's like not just a skill set I'm building, but like a process that I'm building, and this process can be scaled whether I'm ambitious enough to actually do that. Like with you know if I had you know staff on the machines, like I could do more digitizing. Like I don't know if I'd ever get there, but like I kind of built that into the process as something that is potential. But like I said, not sure if I'm the guy to actually pull that off.
Although one day when we come along and you've wrapped a building in a thing, again, we will understand when we say. Right, I'm going to move on to some tricky questions now. Now we've done all the easy, let's talk about art process and all that sort of stuff. Do you have a favourite band?
Yes, I do. Humphreys McGee, who
Okay.
not sure if you've ever heard them. They are like it's a kind of a metal-ish jam band, which it's like if Ozzy Osbourne and the Grateful Dead had a baby, and my best friend got me into them, and they're a touring band, and
Mm-hmm.
you can get all like there's an app called nugs.net, nugs.net, where they have tons of artists and their live shows, and this band has you could pretty much get every show they've done for 25 years, and they've never repeated a set. It's kind of like me,
Wow.
like don't want to do the same
Yeah.
thing over and over again, but the sound that they create is intense, and it's a great joy. And also, for my best friend who got me into this, we always had a hard time keeping in touch. And
Mm-hmm.
because of this band, we're always sending stuff back and forth to each other. So it's actually been a really great part of life to have these days.
Do you listen to music while you're working?
Yeah, definitely. Although I find it hard to sew on a sewing machine, like if I'm using a serger or a sewing machine, because the sound of what's happening is really important, because, you can, you know, things go wrong in sound. Like you can hear it before you see it, I think. And so I find like I can't have headphones on when I'm sewing. I can have it on in the background, kind of low, but I do like to work with music.
Do you think we could play a game where we play the sounds of stitches and we can tell whether you think they're in good shape or not?
I know, right?
Start to make you twitch because you know something's going awry somewhere or something.
Exactly.
I like it. Do you have a favorite book, or what was the last good book that you read?
The last good book I read was by a British journalist, Douglas Murray, on the War on the West.
Okay.
Really interesting stuff. It's it is. I will just say that, like, it was
thought-provoking.
Thought-provoking for sure.
The twist at the end. It turns out it was a romantic comedy.
I know, right? Exactly.
Do you listen to podcasts much? Obviously, other than NeedleXChange.
I have done some podcasts. Sometimes I find it hard to get into it, but I've been a fan of Sam Harris's podcast, Making Sense, these days. I don't know if you know that one. But
I know of him because he appears on all the other ones, doesn't he? All the Lex Friedmans and all those kind of. If you ever want to listen to someone talk for 3 hours,
right,
and put the words Lex Friedman or Andrew Huberman, or just all of the like big talkers, isn't it? They go on for ages.
Yeah,
I haven't quite got to that level yet. Okay. What I was going to ask you ages ago was there's a guy on YouTube, and I think he's called Stephen Machine. I was going to ask you how you feel about Rube Goldberg machines, because I feel like they might appeal to you.
Yeah, like if I, anytime I see a video start, I have to watch it finish. And I do, like, yeah, those things are pretty incredible. It's funny. I feel like, growing up, you asked me like what I like to make. I think there was always an element of like a Rube Goldberg machine in there. Like, how do you kind of do something that's going to like make some other thing happen? Definitely.
Whenever I watch them, because like I said, I found a couple of guys on YouTube recently. There's one guy who's got like 3 million subscribers or whatever. And whenever I see them, I'm so jealous because I really wish I could have the time to make those stuff, because sometimes they're just so bloody clever.
Right,
and it's not even like trick shots. It's just those, the fun ways they can make connections between different things, doing different things and all those kind of things. I thought that would appeal.
And the domino setups, those I like too.
Oh man, I Can you
just
imagine the
watching those.
stress? I feel like the stress of those. I mean, I know with a lot of these Rube Gold machines, they'll kind of like take 35 is the one that eventually works or whatever. But with the
Right.
dominoes, yeah, I like watching them with my kids as well because they are just a little bit mind blowing. And also, I'm saying the likelihood of doing a domino roll in my house is very small. Too much carpet, quite frankly.
Right.
And then film or TV show, last good or favorite?
Well, Spinal Tap, probably favorite. Um, you know, it just like applies to every aspect of life. There's always a moment where you're like, and that correlates with that. Uh, last good one, which was a great one from last year was called "You Hurt My Feelings" with Julia Louis-Dreyfus. It's a,
Okay.
it's about like creativity. It's about a woman who is a writer and she's working on a book, and she happens like she sees her husband with a friend in in a store, and she's like sneaking up on him or about to come up on him, and she hears that he's telling his friend like, oh, her book sucks. And it's just a part, like it's just an area of human experience that I've never seen done in a film, and done very, very well.
Excellent. That does sound, yeah, yeah. God, that's dangerous, isn't it? I don't,
Yeah.
well, I mean, thankfully, my wife's work is just purely marvelous. I say that in case she's listening. So, yeah, how does your family enjoy your work? Just out of interest.
Actually, uh, it's been a real nice bonding thing for me and my kids because they became, they're makers in their own right. Um, and I remember like for them, it was always costuming. Um, they were just into superheroes and stuff like that growing up, and I would, you know, try and show them just techniques along the way, and uh, then there was a point when I guess my older son was probably like 11 or so, and I had taught him how to score cardboard with an X-Acto knife, and he's like, it's okay, Dad, I got it. And I'm like, I mean, I had to walk away and just hope he didn't cut his finger off. And he didn't. um, but yeah, and I know like with my younger son too, like whenever I am working on something, I will show it to him, and like we just discuss the ideas, and that's been a very rich give and take. So definitely, you know, enjoy that part of parenting quite a bit. It's been very
I mean, how do you feel about the sort of context that you're in? Because textile arts, and particularly when you're talking like large scale applique, quilting, that kind of territory being very much an American tradition as well. How do
yeah.
you feel about being part of that equation?
It's always been interesting. Like there was always the kind of what's the novelty factor of being a guy doing this, because
Hmm.
traditionally it's a female centered craft, and in one sense it gives you like like again a little novelty that you can kind of use to your advantage.
Mm.
But at the same time, I've met just a lot of interesting people, men and women who do it. And it's been interesting also to see, when I started it, doing, textile stuff, textiles wasn't not nearly as kind of a hot medium as it has become. So that's been encouraging to see that I've like, you know, picked a good field. Um, Again, my level of ambition though might be the only thing, uh, standing in my way of pushing it to certain levels. But
It always amuses me how sometimes it's like I once did a workshop where we were stitching lyrics onto chairs in a pop-up shop in Camden in London, and it was like about the coolest thing on the planet at that precise moment in time, and then half an hour later it just goes back to being like a little old lady craft where it's so funny how it can
right.
be, in the right setting.
Well, that
Um
actually, when I started doing the flags, the place where I went to get my machine and kind of learn about it was inside of like a Joann's Fabrics. It's a chain in the States, and they had a partnership with Husqvarna, so they would have machines in there. And yeah, all the people I interacted with were like, women over 60. And, so I was always a bit of an outlier in that sense.
But there'll also be the ladies, I bet, who some of them truly appreciate the stuff you're doing with the light and the shimmer and the direction and all that, because they just know it. And it's not
Yeah.
necessarily something you can just talk about with your friends down at the local coffee shop or whatever. So there
Right.
must be some
But
people who just really love it.
yeah, and what was interesting was when I would go and stand out with those flags early on, I noticed like people would just instinctively want to reach out and touch it, like for
Mm-hmm.
that tactility. And as someone who, my background was as much architecture as art, like I was never like an art world person.
Mm-hmm.
And I always found, galleries to be a bit standoffish and, stuffy. And I really like that aspect that people felt so connected tactily to
Mm.
to the medium. And it was one of the reasons that I thought like this is a good medium to go into because there is this natural attraction to it, and it's not the like standoffish.
Yeah.
You
I
know.
think that's really important. And I think there's also this fundamental, like most people can kind of understand how you've made it. Maybe not to a really great degree, but any of this stuff with the needle and thread, it's so familiar
Hmm.
as a global culture or whatever that it automatically engenders people, endears people, one of those two in
Yeah,
your direction.
yeah. There's just I think like an innate connection to it.
Mm. Is there an interesting fact that not a lot of people know about Aaron Fein?
Uh, well, I mean the people that I know it, but like in terms of
People listening to this podcast, on the other hand.
yeah, like from a professional standpoint, like one of the main things in my life is a long time practice of Tai Chi,
Oh,
and that's been yeah very very deep ongoing thing that I think informs the work I do as well. You know, I would say also from that conceptual standpoint of remember that I mentioned that project of the string wall where it was the threaded rods and the string. Like to me, that had like all those elements of yin and yang, where you have like rigid rods and flexible string, and then when you put them together, the string becomes flexible, and then the rods soften because they're covered with string. And there's just always this interplay of opposites, and that is a very important part of my work you know is this interplay of opposites.
how long have you been practicing Tai Chi?
Since before 9/11, I remember that. I started when I was actually, remember I said I went to China. I discovered it right before my trip. I was trying to learn some Chinese language, and I went to a place where they were doing demonstration classes of different things, and I saw a woman doing Tai Chi, and I said, I have to do that.
Yeah.
And yeah, been going ever since.
I did it for a year back in the day. This would have been like 2003, something like that. And it also coincided with me being a town councillor in my local town.
Wow.
And for a while, I was also the chair of the planning committee. It's not a big town, so being the chair of the planning committee is more like, does this single story extension, whatever. But the way it would work is we would do Tai Chi at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday, and the town council meetings were at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday. So I was so chilled when I went to those meetings. It was
Yeah,
unbelievable. I was
right.
virtually unruffleable. And I just loved it. I loved the fact that, like, obviously it's more nuanced, but you'll never be perfect at Tai Chi, right? Because there's
Right.
always something. There's always a little bit more of kind of breathing and placement and all of that kind of stuff.
For sure. Yes, actually,
Yeah.
I've had for 7 or 8 months now this problem with my neck, and I'm just like keep trying to work through it. But like I think part of it is like, well, I'll just keep doing the practice, and hopefully someday that'll dissipate. But at least I have my full range of motion, and maybe I wouldn't if I wasn't doing the practice. So
Mm.
yeah,
And there's a bit of a kind of slowness as well in the production of your art, isn't it? There's a sort of an in and out and a breathing and a sort of
yeah.
just you can't do it at a pace, can you?
No, it doesn't get rushed. I mean, it can't get rushed.
And that's probably quite nice. Do you enjoy the journey of making it?
Yeah, like I say that the process of going through something repetitive, which I have to do, like if I'm making a shape that has, 1,000 little shapes in it, and I have to, just like go click on a bunch of things, select them, do a transformation to them, go to the next thing, do that, like that. Even before I started Tai Chi, like that type of work was very soothing to me. And it was,
Mm-hmm.
I learned, when I was later in life diagnosed ADHD, that you develop coping mechanisms for, how you work. And those are just definitely coping mechanisms. And they, like I said, they soothe and they also get me somewhere.
Mm. Yeah. Fab. Hey, Aaron, thanks for having a needle exchange with me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Been great.